All right. Thank you everyone for joining us for Just Zero's Waste Free Future Summit and this special session communicating about zero waste. My name is Olivia Chabot and I'm the Communications Director at Just Zero. And with me today, I have Brett Nadrich from Break Free from Plastic, Megan Quinn from Waste Dive, and Joseph Winters from Grist. Thank you all so much for being here. Really, really excited to have you and to dive into this conversation about storytelling and how critical it is to the zero waste movement. But before we begin, I just have a couple housekeeping notes. A reminder for everyone that the event is being recorded, and those recordings will be available for folks after the summit is officially over. So those will be coming your way in case you want to rewatch any of these sessions or share them with your friends. Lastly, we will have some time for some audience questions at the end. So as we have this conversation, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask any questions to our panelists, and we'll try to answer as many of those as possible at the very end of this session. All right, so without further ado, the first question I have is really focused on the inevitability of waste. So for years, the way the United States has thought and communicated about waste has been through a lens of something that is inevitable, something we're stuck with that has to be sent to a landfill or incinerator. This is something that environmentalists have been trying to change. So how have you seen the conversation around waste and the ways we manage it evolve over the last few years? And anyone is welcome to jump in. I'd love to hear from all of you on this.
Okay, maybe I'll start. So hi everybody, thanks so much for making time for this discussion. At Waste Dive, one of my main jobs is legislative and policy reporting, and just in the last few years, I've really started to see a lot more of how states, specifically states, but also to a lesser extent the federal government, is crafting legislation around waste and recycling. Extended producer responsibility is becoming a lot more popular in the US, something that has been around in Canada and elsewhere. And we're seeing states and legislatures warm up to the idea of enacting policies for the end-of-life management of all kinds of items. EPR for packaging is the one that's gaining steam currently, but some states have had EPR for all kinds of other things for years, batteries, all kinds of stuff. So that was a policy that was really hard to get off the ground in the US. That's now, we're seeing it show up in legislatures a lot. And then, also just the recycled content mandates that's driving some of the demand for recycled content. It's all, it's happening through legislatures, and also the consumer pressure because, the general public is a lot more educated than they were even a few years ago. They're very concerned about waste. They want to do something about it, and they want big brands and companies to do something about it. So those are just a few trends I'm seeing.
Thanks for that, Megan. Yeah, I agree that these changes at the legislative level are just really sort of heartening. Like the level of education is just so much higher than I think it used to be. I think partly the UN Plastics Treaty has helped. It's been a huge learning experience for a lot of I guess highly engaged people in the plastic space. I do think though that I'm not sure that some of this learning is really trickling down all the way to consumers. I think people are generally concerned about plastics, but sometimes I wonder, are they hearing the big picture solutions that scientists and advocacy groups are really calling for about production and not focusing on waste? I thought of this recently because I went to a beach cleanup for the first time, and I was talking with all these people who presumably are very committed to addressing the plastic crisis. And I asked them, what do you think the most important thing we can be doing right now to solve the crisis is? And I don't think anyone said reduce plastic production. And I was so shocked. Everyone was like, I've heard that they're trying to make plastics out of seaweed now and mushrooms. And it's like, oh, interesting that that's your number one solution. So yeah, I don't know. I think that more work needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with all that. Just echoing what Megan and Joseph have said here. You know, I'm with the Break Free from Plastic movement. I'm Brett Nadrich. I do our US and Canada communications, and like supporting our members in doing that. What I have found is that there is a centering of that storytelling of those most impacted that is starting to make its way into the media, especially, and credit to the journalists, including folks here who are telling those stories. For example, in Modesto, California, they just shut down the last industrial incinerator. Actually, I think December 2nd is going to be the day that it officially goes offline. Valley Improvement Projects, who's a BFFP member, Tom Helm, Bianca Lopez, a bunch of folks at that organization are the ones who made that possible. And we've seen a ton of media coverage about the cost of that, right? Like some of the folks who founded that organization are no longer with us, right? Because they died of the health impacts of burning that waste. So those stories are being told. Over the 5 years I've been working with Break Free from Plastic, I've seen it more and more. But to Joseph's point, I don't know that that's necessarily breaking through into the mainstream discourse. That said, echoing what Joseph said about the Global Plastics Treaty, we've seen a lot of imagery that is finally getting through to the public about the health impacts of this, right? And understanding that the waste that is being polluted out into our environment is also being polluted inside of our bodies. And one image that I've seen floating around in the Global Plastics Treaty space that I think gets that point across to a broader public is kind of a side by side of polluted rivers with all of the plastic waste we see, and then our polluted veins, which also have all of this microplastic pollution inside of them, right? So that sort of imagery is starting to break through, but I think there's a lot more education to be done.
Completely agree with you all there. And imagery is so important too. I think being able to see and visualize things makes such a difference. I think also being able to share the relevancy. How is this relevant to me? That's what, if people don't understand how something is relevant to them, how it impacts them, it's not going to really sink in. So I think that's something that a lot of the messaging has changed around as well, making it more relevant to everyone in their everyday lives to help really drive the point across that, yeah, waste is impacting you and your community and all of us in our health every day. Any other thoughts on that question before we move on?
I just wanted to add, I was thinking about this question ahead of the meeting, and thinking about the role that journalists play in like presenting these ideas to the public. I think there's like a really important way that sort of rhetorical frameworks around the plastics issue can play a role in shaping the public's perception of these crises. I think about this a lot when I see the term plastic pollution crisis repeated so often. Is it a plastic pollution crisis? Is it a plastics crisis? Like these are decisions that we as reporters are constantly making, whether we are consciously making them or not. And so I think it's super important for the media to be savvy and not just like regurgitate whatever language they're fed by. I think you need to be critical of both sides of the spectrum, but just know what you're doing when you're phrasing things or presenting arguments.
Such a great point. Awesome. All right, so we'll move on. So the plastic pollution crisis, as we just thought of that phrase, is something that we know a lot of folks watching are concerned about. So what are the biggest challenges when it comes to communicating about such a large, terrifying, and important topic? And Brett, I think I'd love to start with you on this, and then Megan and Joseph, if you want to chime in after, I'd love to hear your input as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So it is indeed such a big crisis and so interconnected with these other crises, right? With the climate crisis, with the biodiversity loss. One way that we get around those challenges is by distilling some of these key concepts into those really tight talking points and like the sort of visual frames that we were talking about earlier. So some of these I've been repeating since I started this job, right? Like more than 99% of plastics are made of fossil fuels. that is a fact that we still have to repeat over and over again, because the folks who have heard it are still like, oh, wow, it really is 99%, right? And a lot of folks have not heard it. Most of the general public still doesn't realize that the number is that high. And our polling shows that, right? Another frame I really like, this is shout out to The Story of Plastic and some great filmmakers who made that award-winning documentary. If you haven't seen it, there's a bunch of amazing activists in that. And I apologies, I can't remember exactly who said it because we've repeated it so often in the movement now. But we talk about how plastic doesn't break down in the environment. It breaks up into tinier and tinier microplastic particles, right? And then there's just like hard data, right? Like only 5 to 6% of plastics are recycled in this country. And then, of course, like you have to get into the details, like it's post-consumer plastics, right? That's the annual rate in this country for post-consumer plastics. We used to think it was 9%. Some amazing researchers confirm that it's 5 to 6%. And then going back to what you were saying, Olivia, like we do have to make it personal for folks. And so that is where I think the storytelling comes in, whether that's storytelling about health impacts, storytelling about the folks who are living at the fence line of production, or if it's even like, I think when it comes to a broader public and thinking about the audience for this discussion and thinking about zero waste in particular, my favorite example is like when I tell folks, they're like, oh, what do you do for a living? And it's, oh, I work in plastics, right? Well, help me understand, like, what does it look like to fight plastic pollution? So I always ask, when you go to the supermarket, think about the last time you bought a fresh apple or a fresh pear, right? Was there some thin plastic bag there for you to grab and use to grab that piece of fruit? Why? Like, why is that there, right? That is there because it's an entirely supply side driven issue, right? Like someone wanted to sell that bag, and so they cut a deal to pump this stuff into every crack and crevice of our society. And I feel like once you get through to people that it's like part of our lived experience and we've been socialized in these ways, that makes it really personal for people. And then they see it as an onboard.
Thanks, Brett. Joseph or Megan, do either of you want to chime in?
Sure. Yeah, I think Brett made a really important point about making it personal. I think for me as a reporter, I have the mainly business community that are our readers, but then I also have the friends, the family, the random acquaintances, my neighbors who know that I work in this industry. And the concerns that those two types of folks have are maybe somewhat different, but are also somewhat related. And it's an issue of, okay, what's the audience and what are the concerns? And I think when, I'm at a party and I'm standing next to the recycling bin and we're having pizza and someone's like, oh, ask Megan, like, we can't put this in the bin, right? They want to know, like, are we doing the right thing? And that's something that can be you respond to that with like, education and data in a way that's fun because we're at a party. And then at the same time, on Waste Dive, the issue isn't, is this pizza box recyclable? It's what are all the, the business metrics, the commodities values, things like that. And it's the same thing, right? Where it's like, there's the business side of recycling. And, what is it going to take to, make money, but also divert the waste? What are the innovations there? So I think it's, the solution isn't to be like, oh, you're freaking out over nothing. It's, everybody has legitimate concerns, and it's an issue of, what's going to be the right bit of information, the correct and accurate information that is going to address concerns, but also move that education along. And I think especially when, recycling, zero waste, waste reduction, waste prevention, all of those things are complex, but that's not an excuse not to, really try to break it down in a way that does get at the personal.
Yeah, I like both of those responses from you guys. I'll just add a couple things that I think that this well, first of all, Grist is like very committed to climate and environmental solutions, and so that's one way to sort of try to engage people in this issue. Especially because I think with plastics, like the top line issue is so satisfyingly simple, like reducing plastic production, that it's easy for people to grasp and get on board with. And yeah, I think it's very compelling. So that's one way to engage people in a otherwise scary issue. The other thing that I'll say is Brett mentioned sort of the, I think he was alluding to like how we're learning more and more about how the plastics industry did basically the same thing as the fossil fuel industry in terms of like deceiving the public about around the promise of recycling. And that narrative I find is very powerful and compelling to readers, because it sort of takes away this like abstract problem. Oh, there's more and more plastic pollution, but it kind of like names the reasons why there is so much plastic pollution in the first place and who should be held accountable for that. And yeah, I think that's a really powerful and useful framing that people should be using more often.
Completely agree. Something that I know at Just Zero we always try to do, because it is a scary topic, and especially when you start talking about the health impacts and the different ways that plastic and waste can impact you and your personal health, your life, your loved ones. That's scary. And so something that, we're definitely trying to do is always come at it like, yes, this is scary. It can, it's an issue, but here are the solutions. We're always trying to drive the message of like, but there are solutions. There's solutions available right now that if we would just implement, we could make a lot of really great change. So that's, something that we're always trying to really highlight the solutions that are available and that we're, continuing to explore as, a positive note to all of this, even though it is scary and can be terrifying. So, any other thoughts on this question before we move on to our next one? All right, great. So often communicating about these topics involves explaining things that are complex and technical. Chemical recycling is a perfect example of this. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, chemical recycling refers to an array of technologies that, according to the plastic industry, can break plastics down into their basic building blocks, which are then used to manufacture new plastics. So, Joseph, I'd love to start with you on this because I know it's a topic you've covered quite frequently. How do you explain something as confusing as chemical recycling to the public in a way that is informative and engaging?
Well, thanks for saving the hard question for me. Yeah, look, it's like a very hard thing. And honestly, I kind of, whenever I realize, oh, this is going to have to involve explaining chemical recycling, I kind of like have to brace myself. But I think that the strategy that I have leaned on is, I think that Grist, so, our general audience is not really going to be that interested in like the nitty-gritty technological details of what's happening. And so I try to like lay out a broad overview of what chemical recycling technologies entail, and then really focus on like the rationale behind them and the reasons why the industry is talking about them so often. There's like this narrative behind chemical recycling. And I think that that's the primary role that chemical recycling is playing right now, to be honest, because so little of it is actually happening. And so, yeah, you describe, look, here's chemical recycling. It's trying to address this problem. There's so much post-consumer plastic out there that is quote unquote hard to recycle, whether because it's too contaminated or it's too flimsy, it has too many chemicals contaminating it, whatever. And chemical recycling represents this promise that that kind of plastic can be recycled endlessly in a perfect circular loop. And so, okay, then you represent the industry side of things, and then you can kind of bring in the perspective from scientists and media investigations and advocacy groups that have tried to like vet those claims and like see whether chemical recycling is actually doing what it claims to do. And virtually all of the investigations have shown that that's not the case. So yeah, just tying all of my chemical recycling reporting to that sort of narrative battle is kind of my strategy.
That's super helpful. And it's great that, part of your strategy is to get input from all these different people, all these different groups, because that does help tell the bigger picture, which, you know, when you hear one side, that might not be the full picture. Brett or Megan, do either of you have any thoughts on this? Yeah, Brett, go ahead.
Happy to jump in, sure. Yeah, I'll just say quickly, like I do think the narrative piece is everything. It's just like the technologies we were talking about earlier. You know, you see it in like the energy space as far as like all this talk of like, you know, algae and things like that, but it's a fraction of the actual investment of these energy companies' portfolios, right? It's the same thing. Like there's so much talk about these so-called advanced recycling facilities. Very few of them are operational or even like planned in a really serious way. A lot of it is a rhetorical argument. Just from an organizing standpoint, what I'll say is like it depends on who, right? Communications is about getting the right message in front of the right audience based on the decision that they're looking to make. From our side, right? Not being a reporter, right? What we're trying to do is influence folks. And so at a local level, what we found working with communities that have these so-called advanced recycling facilities cited in their area is it helps to distinguish this from other technologies. And the way we've done that is by calling it plastic burning. And that is essentially what it is, right? Pyrolysis and gasification are, by another name, this way to incinerate waste. And there's this whole semantic argument about whether it's aerobic or anaerobic. Is there oxygen in the chamber? But the oxygen, can you ever really prevent 100% of oxygen? Once we go down that road, it's like we've already lost this narrative battle and we are on our defensive heels while the industry is controlling everything. And so that's why, as a movement, we refer to this as plastic burning. And we make the industry then defend these so-called solutions, right? And there's, I'm going to, again, these little quips are helpful. Attorney General Rob Bonta for California is suing ExxonMobil for deceptive practices around recycling, right? I have seen it. He was here for Climate Week in New York City, making the stump speech. Can't blame him for making the same speech, but I heard the same line twice and it stuck with me, that advanced recycling is neither advanced nor recycling. It's a good line, right? I will also, if you pardon my language personally, and this is me as Brett, not as Break Free, but I like to say that advanced recycling is advanced bullshit. That is what's advanced about it. That's why we're talking about it now. It's all just advanced rhetoric. So I'll stop with that.
That was great. I love that, Brett. Megan, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I also cover chemical recycling pretty frequently. Waste Dive's audience is undoubtedly different than Grist audience in this regard because it is a lot more, you know, people want to know like, what's the business case for this? And I think that the same points that both Brett and Joseph brought up factor into the business case for chemical recycling or against chemical recycling, depending on, you know, what's there. Because it is, the Waste Dive audience does care about the nitty gritty of the technology, first of all. And our audience really cares about getting it right when it, you know, is it a methanolysis plant? Is it a pyrolysis plant? You know, what's the exact technology? Because that really goes into that conversation of, you know, what you hear from these companies when they are going to these communities and saying, hey, no, like, we're not burning anything. This is, you know, totally different technology. And so from my perspective, you know, for better or worse, like I need to get the wording correct because I don't want to be contributing to disinformation about any of these technologies. And at the same time, because, you know, I write about it as a business, it's really the things that I'm looking for are, okay, we saw a lot of announcements for, you know, agreements, offtake agreements and things, you know, last year, early in this year. We're seeing less of that now. What does that mean? You know, so that's something I'm looking at. And also, I think it'll be really interesting to see legislatively. I know this comes back to legislation for me in some way, because at the state level, so many states have adopted state laws that reclassify these technologies as manufacturing and not waste management. So that is going to factor into how states are, you know, interacting with these businesses when it comes time for permitting, things like that. So that's really important. And then also at the federal level, you know, we're also seeing federal legislation, who knows whether it'll move or not, but for the last few years, we've seen a lot of federal legislation that talks about chemical recycling in one way or the other. You know, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, for example, you know, like there's a big provision in there that would pause all kinds of, you know, those operations to look into it further. So I think from my perspective, every story is going to be different based on, you know, which part of that we're covering, and that all needs to be accurate. And, you know, when our audience wants to know, like, okay, well, like, you know, I'm a MRF, like, should I sign an agreement with one of these companies? Is this going to be good for my business? Like, I can't answer that directly, but I can show, like, hey, here's what's going on. And I think that will be, you know, that's something that we'll be looking into in the coming years, and it's ongoing right now. And I think also the Exxon lawsuit that Brett mentioned, that'll be an interesting way to kind of look at, while that's going on, you know, what kind of details will come out and how that's going to affect how these businesses operate or don't operate in the future. So.
Definitely. Great. Okay, we do need to move on to the next question. But before we do, we have a poll that we are going to publish here. So everyone should be getting a poll pop up on their screen. If you could fill that out and submit that, that'd be great. It's regarding communication preferences, how you get your news, your information, especially about sustainability and environmental topics. So we want to hear from you and how you get your news. And this will relate directly to the question that I'm going to ask our panelists next. All right, so reporting on zero waste has primarily been through traditional journalistic mediums like print and television. However, new forms of communication, social media, Reels, TikTok, to name a few, have opened the door to new forms of storytelling. So how do you see these new formats impacting the way we communicate about zero waste? And Megan, I'd love to start with you on this.
Sure. So in my just regular life, you know, when I'm not working, I used to try to kind of have a divide between waste related stuff that was social media related, because I was like, oh, I work on this stuff every day. But there's so many engaging content creators that are doing really great work. And I just feel like the more the better, especially because there are certain topics that I learn about better from certain mediums like TikTok. So, you know, to like call it a specific example, like Fran from Glass Half Full, you know, she has a whole TikTok page. It's like all of her, you know, glass recycling. She does a lot of like, you know, conservation things. And I think that that's something, the way that she is talking, the audience that she has and the things that she's talking about are really specific, but, you know, that is how we're getting our information now. And, you know, if I was a little more social media savvy and I had my own, you know, I don't know that you'll see me on TikTok anytime soon, but these are, you know, these are really valuable ways to talk about these things and to get into some of the little subcategories of zero waste that, you know, for example, we might not be able to get into in like an 800-word story, for example. So.
Sorry, I'm just gonna go for it. I have been thinking a lot about this question over the past week for various reasons. But I think it's interesting to say that new forms of communication have opened the door to new forms of storytelling. It's an optimistic way to put it. When I see that, you know, the door is being closed on some of the forms of media that we traditionally think of as like being effective, including print and like honestly even online media. Like I'm not confident that enough people are actually reading through. Actually, I know that not enough people are actually reading through entire articles, and so I don't really know what the answer is, but it is going to have to be some major shift in the way that we try to communicate issues to the public. I was struck the other day because I think it was The Guardian had some Instagram post. It was just like a series of it was a carousel with like 20 slides, a whole bunch of slides. And I got all the way to the end and I'm like, oh my God, they just tricked me into reading a whole article on Instagram. And so I think that it doesn't necessarily, I mean, yeah, sometimes it's going to need to be in a different format, but or like, you know, videos or I don't know, doing cartoons or something, but in some ways you can just repackage the existing journalism that we're already doing and present it in a different way that could be more compelling or enticing.
Well, Joseph, you'll be happy to see that news websites or online publications came back as the highest way that most people who have joined us today are getting their news about sustainability and environmental topics. So that's exciting. Brett, do you have anything to add? And especially anyone want to jump in regards to the poll results either?
Yeah, I appreciate it. I just want to underscore what Joseph was saying, and like I feel for you in terms of like folks not reading through to the end of the article. I mean, a lot of times you have the back end data to see it and you're like, oh man, we just, same thing with videos. It's like if it's too long, I think our attention spans are so short, all of us, like even myself compared to 5 years ago, I know I need to sit down and commit to reading a long form piece, right? As opposed to like having the time in my life. I don't know where it went. That's another panel for another day. But I mean, this is the new media landscape we're in, right? It's not to say that traditional media and reporting will go away, but I think that we've seen, I mean, polls show a lack of trust in mainstream media, and then viewership and readership of these new media platforms, like especially podcasts, there's a handful of mostly male comedians, right, or former political pundits who have these huge followings. Again, I'll say like some of those folks, especially the more conservative ones, are very open to messaging around like the toxic health impacts of plastics and the way that this waste is harming our bodies and polluting the planet. I'll even go back like thinking about what our new political landscape will look like over the years ahead, and thinking about a more conservative Republican White House. Like the National Park Service was created by Teddy Roosevelt, right? Like the whole thing is about protecting these lands. So there's a long, complicated history around all of that. But I think that there's an opportunity to utilize like podcasts, especially, I think, and then also social media influencers. And we just live in this internet era where everything is so fractured that there's all these not just influencers, but then there's micro influencers. And like, you're trying to work, like Megan brought someone up. I can name probably 3 or 4 folks, and we could all name people who we may never have heard of, right? But that individual has so much influence over even the lives of those of us here who are doing this professionally. So I do think it's just a new media landscape. And like, when we worked with influencers, when I started with Break Free a few years ago, it was all free content sharing stuff. Now, like they have managers and they command a heavy price for, lifting up some of these messages. So brave new world. That's all I can say.
Brave new world indeed. Yeah, it's really interesting having all these new tools to communicate and tell different stories with. And it's something that, I think it's better to try it out rather than, fight it. And because that's where it's going. So it's really cool to see, especially, the environmental world try out all these different mediums to get the message out there in different ways and to more audiences then too. All right, so the next question that I have, and Megan, I'll start with you on this one. Communities across the country are increasingly focused on passing new laws and policies that reduce waste, improve recycling, and hold companies accountable for the waste they create. What are the challenges you face when trying to report and communicate about legislative campaigns?
Yeah, thanks for asking this question. This is my big passion. I love writing about this. I love talking to people about this. I think the main challenge is, again, the nuance, right? Because we have 50 states in the US. Depending on what kind of policies you're looking at, we're also looking at provinces in Canada as well. And every state's different. Every state has a different stakeholder makeup. You might see the same types of stakeholders from place to place, but the way they interact, the things that they want, the way it's going to impact existing attitudes, policies, neighborhoods, just things like that are going to be a little different from state to state. And for me personally, I need to be understanding that dynamic if I'm going to accurately report on, how legislation is introduced and passed in each state. I think if you look at EPR as just like another example where, EPR laws get introduced every year. They're not all the same. EPR for packaging laws that exist are very different from state to state. And to understand why that is, you have to understand why, in Colorado, there's the different rural and urban interactions and how that played into the EPR policy that ended up getting put into place versus place like California or Maine. So this is self-serving, but the way that I can learn more about that is, when these policies are being written and workshopped, and stakeholders are talking about this stuff year round, not just during the legislative season, obviously. And the off season is a great time to chit chat with me about what's happening. I'm currently doing that with a couple folks in a couple different states who are helping me understand, states that I don't live in, states that I don't interact with folks as much as maybe some other states that are a little more active in this space. I think also, just understanding like what the priorities are from year to year. So that's a hurdle, but it's the thing that I love doing. So I like to call it a challenge. Call it a challenge feels wrong. It's just like part of the reporting process. And yes, and we do, Waste Dive does keep track of both state and federal legislation that's happening for recycling and waste to some degree. So let me know what you're working on. Would love to hear from you all. And I'm also curious to know, sort of like what trends are happening. One thing that we didn't talk about a lot, or it came up a little bit, is, I read a lot about recycling policies, but, a couple of years ago, we were supposed to be starting to get a lot more reuse and, things like that. And I'm like, where is that stuff? When's that happening? So I think we'll start seeing some of that coming up soon, but those are just my general thoughts on that.
Great, thanks, Megan. I was especially interested in how during the off season you want to meet with folks in different states, in different areas, and learn about what they're doing, what's going on in their town. And I love that. I think that just opens you up to so much more information and viewpoints. So that's really cool that that's an approach that you take. Brett or Joseph, do you have anything that you'd like to share?
I can go. I don't cover legislative stuff nearly as closely as Megan, but when I do cover it, a couple things that I thought of that can be challenging are like just the different priorities around EPR can be difficult to sort of parse through because EPR, I feel like it's often represented as this sort of monolithic kind of policy, but then you have the EPR, the versions of EPR that are supported by industry groups, and then the more ambitious EPR policies that are supported by advocacy groups, and sort of threading the needle between those two kinds of approaches can be difficult. It can be difficult for me to even understand, let alone like communicate to the public. So that's one thing. And then when you mentioned reuse, Megan, I guess this isn't necessarily strictly like legislation related, but it can be so difficult to cut through all of the PR around different reuse solutions that I get. It's just so many products that people want me to write about, and it can be hard to know like what is a legitimate solution, which one is like, trying in good faith to solve this problem, which one just wants to sell their product.
Yep, I think that meshes with my experience as well. I'll just say on the EPR side, just echoing what Megan and Joseph have said here, we actually, out of necessity, only message around EPR in like specific case studies, because we've found that it is so different, not only from state to state and in terms of federal legislation, good and bad versions put forward based on our analysis, but also like we have colleagues, Break Free from Plastic's a global movement. We have colleagues in India who were pushing hard against EPR there and wanted to do a big global campaign. And we explained that like we can't do that because there's some really good EPR in the US and some bad EPR. So I think that's a phenomenon that's just like all over the world. I'll also just note on the reuse policy piece, again, I think while the policies, you have to get into the nuance of like, okay, is this legislation actually going to advance the right type of solutions that we want? Are there the financial mechanisms to help protect small businesses from, negative externalities or like a transition period, all that sort of stuff. And at the same time, I think like the first thing we say going into meetings with, whether it's corporate executives or policymakers, other decision makers, we have models for this, right? We have the milkman, right? Not that long ago. Many of these folks remember that. And so just giving people this idea of like, you get a bottle at your doorstep, you use the product, you bring it back, there's an industrial washer. The industrial washer creates jobs, right? Like you can just sort of build the frame from there. I'll also selfishly just plug, if people are interested in seeing how we talk about complex policy, we have a US Global Plastics Treaty media briefing tomorrow. So that's mostly for journalists. This is a reminder to Joseph and Megan if you'd like to join. But for other folks who are on the call as well, I'll drop the registration here just because it is a real life case study to see like we are actively communicating ahead of the final round of these negotiations. Here's what these complex policy solutions look like in a global legislative framework. And here's how that translates into real solutions in your country and your individual life.
Wonderful. Those were all fantastic responses. I am going to move us on because we're getting close to the end, and I still have one more question before we dive into our audience questions. So, as we all know, big event took place last Tuesday. The results of the 2024 election will drastically change the federal political landscape. So, how do you see these results impacting the way we communicate about zero waste? Anyone who wants to start can jump in first.
Maybe I'll jump in quickly only because I think I already touched on this a bit. I think now that the new administration is clearly a more conservative Republican administration, not just in the White House, but also in Congress, there is this opportunity to lean into the parts of this plastics crisis that matter the most to those bases and those core demographics, right? So I think like it's a horseshoe theory, and there's a lot of overlap in terms of the folks who care about the health crisis in particular. So I think there's good work to be done in terms of leaning into those narratives and the sort of new media platforms we were just talking about.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this, over the next few years, the like personal narratives are going to become increasingly more important to highlight, just because I'm not. Yeah, I think that my answer will depend on like who we're trying to reach. But this administration is obviously not going to be compelled by like arguments, making some claim about the need to protect the environment for future generations. Like obviously this is not compelling to them. But maybe it would be more powerful to highlight individual stories, and that could resonate with like what Brett was saying with the base.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely depends on who the audience is. I think, this is very broad characterization, but, we saw from the last Trump administration, a lot of business focus and deregulation that I think had benefited some waste and recycling businesses back then. I don't know enough about the future now to see how that will play out, but, you can expect that might be the case this time. And so, for us at Waste Dive, we're really looking at, okay, well, what is this going to mean for, businesses that are operating in this space now? And yeah, and at the same time, Project 2025, which I know is not like directly related to the Trump administration, but it did call out specifically wanting to eliminate certain parts of the EPA, specifically environmental justice, like an entire environmental justice office, which is something that we write about a lot, which is obviously like a huge impact. So we'll be focusing on, how this is going to impact these already ongoing environmental justice issues that were already a problem, regardless of the administration, and will be, more of a focus moving forward. So I think those are just sort of some general themes, but you know, it's going to be, it's going to depend on, you know, who's reading us, you know, how we write about that, but those are things that are going to affect everybody, regardless of, you know, where you come down on that.
Great. Thank you all for your thoughtful responses to that. So we have a little time left, and I do want to get to some of our audience questions. So the first one is, how can those on the front lines work with journalists to have their stories heard? So Megan or Joseph, do either one of you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I was just talking about this with my editor about how I would like to do more reporting on the sort of upstream. I assume this is what the speaker was asking about, like the upstream impacts of plastic production. And so, yeah, I have struggled because Grist is not like a breaking news outlet, and I feel like a lot of the like easier to reach stories have already been told by outlets like the New York Times, ProPublica, or whatever. And so, yeah, I would welcome people to reach out to me. I guess I can drop my email address, but yeah, I'm always like trying to find stories that have not already been told.
Yeah, I mentioned environmental justice a minute ago. I think I would love to talk to people who are directly affected by a lot of these issues. I think sometimes it's hard to connect with folks, because as a reporter coming, like airdropping into a community and being like, I want to cover your community, it really comes across as disrespectful and not educated. And it really like speeds things up when you're reaching out to us, just so we know that, you know, this is important, especially because there are a lot of these topics where, you know, these stories really need more perspective from people who are being impacted by these issues. And we're just not always sure like where to find folks. And so, yes, reach out to us. We want to hear from you for sure.
Brett, I'd love your perspective on this too. Even though the question was specific to journalists, I think that communications inside organizations as well have a role in this.
Yeah, totally. I mean that sort of to Joseph's point, it's like, if y'all are doing this work and want to be a member of the movement, like we're always looking for new members. You know, my part of my job is to make sure that as we as a movement are engaging with members of the media, we're centering the voices of those most impacted. And it's refreshing to hear from the journalists who are reporting on these issues that the personal storytelling element of that and the personal impacts those folks are feeling in their body, in their family, in their community, in their economy, right? Those are the stories that really matter. They're the stories that change hearts and minds.
Perfect. All right, so the next question from one of our audience members is, zero waste work is constantly evolving and it can be hard to keep up. Any tips on how folks can identify misinformation or greenwashing in waste stories? It's a great question. Feel free to jump in if you have a response.
I'm a little biased because I work really hard to not be part of this you know, problem. And when I'm reading, you know, because we all read each other's publications, right? Like we're all reading stuff all the time. So I have my list of you know, outlets where I'm like, they have a track record of understanding these topics. And I think it's just sort of like any media literacy where it's like, consider the source and consider who's, you know, being interviewed, not being interviewed. I know that that's really simplistic, but you know, I think there are outlets that like don't always write about these issues, and that doesn't make them, you know, not the right outlet to read. I think that it's just an issue of considering, you know, in the context of these pretty complex issues, like if you're hearing something that you're like, is this real? Then that might be a red flag. I don't know. So
If it's about a product, then I would just view it very skeptically in general. So that's maybe one piece of advice. I agree with Megan that like it's a good idea to just generally have a list of sources that you trust and go to them first. And this especially reminds me of some of the coverage I've seen in like the major outlets about the plastics treaty negotiations, I think have been off the mark. And so, yeah, I think I'm not sure how to like go about choosing which outlets are the most trustworthy, but you have at least two options here represented in this call.
Yeah. I think no, I mean, we could have a whole panel about media literacy and like again, the new media piece of this. And as we're engaging with not just reporters, but also now like influencers and other folks, right? It's like the main thing I would say is from like for me personally, in addition to the product piece, because I think the product placement is insane. There's so much paid media now. But the other thing is like, if it's too good to be true, if it sounds too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true, right? And I think that's true of most of these chemical recycling technologies, these advanced recycling technologies, right? I do appreciate like Megan was getting into the distinctions between like most of them are pyrolysis and gasification. We consider that plastic burning. There's also like chemical solvolysis processes. Those are not all created equal. Different people have different opinions. But when we've gotten to that level of nuance, if folks are still reading, then like we've got them. That's great, right? Like we're deep in the nuances of the issue. I think it's just about helping them understand, like from the get-go, this thing sounds like plastic burning, like let's get into that a little bit, right? Or on the flip side, if it's a pyrolysis gasification facility, or on the flip side, like if I have to read one more piece about plastic eating bacteria that's been manufactured, it's like, and then my friends are like, hey, I keep hearing about this plastic eating bacteria. Like, when's that going to be a thing? It's like, no, it's too good to be true. Like, the solutions are far simpler than that, right? They're legislative, they're tech, but they're low tech, right? Like, they're the milkman and reusable glass bottles. And a big shout out to, again, like, we're a movement led by those most impacted, including folks in the global south. In parts of like a lot of our colleagues are in the Philippines, they're fighting sachets, these little plastic like ketchup packets, right? They're like, we used to wrap stuff in banana leaves here, right? Like wholly compostable byproduct of our agriculture. So they're technological solutions, but they're simple, right? And if it sounds too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true.
Yeah. Sorry, I fully agree. All of those technological solutions, I just, anytime there's like, they're trying to add layers of complexity, I think that is a red flag when a lot of the solutions really are as simple as what you're describing, like the banana leaf, or just reducing the amount of plastic that's produced in the first place. Yeah.
A lot of the solutions are honestly very simple and things that used to be in place. I would just add that I think one thing that I know I do, especially if it's a source I don't know, an outlet I haven't read before, I try to come at the piece of content with a critical eye, a critical lens, and really not taking everything for granted that they're telling me, saying like, is that true? Like, is that real? Like, let me go to this source that's linked. Let me, look into this a bit more. Just trying for myself to educate and really looking into something before just believing it at face value.
Totally. And just to point out that like I feel like all of our responses are sort of assuming that people are reading like news articles online. And so my other like high level piece of advice is like, don't get your news from like an algorithm on social media. Sorry, but that's just not, I don't believe in that.
100%. Yeah. If you already have trusted sources, those are probably the right ones to continue getting your news from. Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question here. We've gotten a few questions from the audience about public health. As we've discussed, there has been a lot of focus on the public health impacts associated with plastics. A recent UCLA health newsletter mentioned the new study about plastic being found in heart plaque. Do you envision joining forces with the medical community to emphasize that drinking plastic bottled water, disposable coffee cups, etc., can have serious health impacts. Feel free to jump in if you have a response.
I could go from the sort of NGO nonprofit advocacy side. We're already working with those folks, right? And we're seeing that they're increasingly important allies in this space. I will note that just this past Climate Week in September here in New York City, Dr. Leo Tresandi, who's a pediatrician at NYU Langone, held a 2-day symposium on plastics and health. I think it was quietly groundbreaking. Like looking around the room and seeing, Dr. Pete Myers and Dr. Shauna Swan, right? Folks who coined the term endocrine disruption and, I have identified how plastics are leading to low sperm rates and low sperm counts and low fertility rates. That symposium brought together all of these different medical researchers, studying the endocrine system, studying reproductive health, studying the human heart, the human brain. And the thing that was kind of terrifying was there are various degrees of scientific consensus in all of those fields of study, but the initial presentation was about the consensus across the board that there's no doubt that the toxic chemicals in plastics and the microplastic and nanoplastic particles themselves are impacting all of these systems in our bodies. So we're just on the cusp of these medical breakthroughs where I want to be quiet momentarily and turn it over to the reporters here who have been doing really good work to break these stories, right? I think honestly, it's like every week or so now, there's like a new barrier that's being crossed, literally crossing the blood-brain barrier, right? Or being found in maternal human placenta, or being found in dolphins' breath. Like, it's just crazy now at this point. We've really almost literally jumped the shark. So I don't know what we do with that besides continue working with medical professionals to kind of bridge the gap between scientific information, which is really dense. And you have to say, we're 90% sure about this thing, we're 50% sure about this other thing. But as professional communicators, I think it's our responsibility to help the public understand, much in the same way that climate change is no longer up for debate, whether certain politicians like it or not, there is scientific consensus around a lot of the health impacts here.
Yeah, I agree with everything Brett was saying. I don't think I would say that we're what was it, joining forces with with medical professionals, but Grist is covering a lot of these studies, and I think that it's one of the most powerful entries into caring more about the plastics issue for the public. I especially, we joked a lot in the newsroom about all of these studies finding microplastics in testes and whatever. It's okay, men will finally care about the plastic pollution crisis. But it's honestly we'll take what we can get to get people to care about this issue. So yeah, I think it's extremely important to highlight all of the research that's going on.
I think from a waste dive perspective, because we don't often write specifically about health impacts, but we do know that that's obviously a huge part of the business aspect, and also we see that in the push for reusables, and finding plastic free alternatives, and just sort of where in the ecosystem there can be trade-offs. So that's something that's pretty interesting just to cover from that aspect. I think also we do talk about PFAS a lot, which is different, but it has a similar conversation where it's PFAS is everywhere. It's the forever chemical. It's literally in our bodies right now. And the way that we talk about PFAS and the way we talk about plastic health impacts is similar. And I think that that's something that I'll be definitely tracking and seeing how that will play out in terms of our business, because our business is going to change how they do business. Are we going to see this impact just how people invest, which to frame it that way, oh yeah, this will impact investment, seems heartless, but in the business community, it's a line item too. So it's you can definitely care about people's health and safety, and then also be okay, what is that going to cost us to change it, and what options are available to us to change that? So I think that's really going to be something that I'll be tracking, along with, we're getting more research every day into this. So that's something that I'll be reading all of those reports as well.
And I'll just add, a lot of these scientific reports can be really complex and hard for people to understand. So I think part of all of our roles is to try and understand that and make that research, that data, a little more accessible so that we can bring it to the public, so that we can share that and make it known this is happening. This is what plastic does to your health. And that opens it up to more people being brought into the issue and understanding what this is and why we're all advocating for a better future with less waste. All right, so that is all the time we have. I just want to give a huge shout out to all of you, our panelists. Thank you so much, Megan, Joseph, and Brett, for joining us today. We greatly appreciate all of your insight, your expertise, and the time and effort you brought to this. So thank you so much. Thank you to our audience, everyone who joined the conversation today. We really appreciate you being interested and joining in the chat and the Q&A as well. So thank you for your time. But we do have 2 more upcoming sessions as part of our Waste Free Future Summit, one of which is tonight at 7:30 p.m. So please make sure to join us. We'd love to have you there. And then we have our very last session tomorrow, Friday at 3 p.m. on the future of zero waste advocacy. So thank you again, everyone. We really appreciate it. Just a reminder that all of the sessions are being recorded and they will be made available to you after the summit is completely over, so that you can rewatch and share with friends and family. Thank you all.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.